My own children slid a paper across the table and told me to sign away my 720-acre ranch or be left with nothing. The house where I raised them was reduced to a line that said I could only live there on borrowed mercy. In that moment, I remembered the days in uniform, standing on a field with 300 soldiers waiting for my command. Back then, I never surrendered. I felt the same fire rise again. I held back my tears and stayed silent. The very children I trusted and gave all my love to now turned against me. They thought I would bend. They did not know what was coming next. They slid the document toward me like it was a casual thing. A simple errand, one signature, just a formality, they said. Across the top of the page, in bold, blocky type, were the words, Property Transition and Succession Agreement, Salt Creek Holdings. And just like that, the place I had lived for 42 years, the land my late husband and I worked from dawn to dusk, and the home where I raised all three of them, was being handed back to me with conditions. The part that hit the hardest wasn't the technical language or the bold lines about transferring full authority. It was one sentence near the bottom. It read, The occupant, Lorraine Adair, may remain on the premises in the guest quarters, contingent on behavior and mental clarity. I felt my fingers tighten. Guest quarters, contingent on behavior, mental clarity. They never said it out loud, but it was all there, in legal ink. Travis was the one who spoke first. He always was the boldest, the most confident. We just want what's best for the ranch, Mum. You're not getting any younger, and it's time we take over the heavy lifting. This gives you security, stability. I stared at him. Belinda leaned forward, her voice sugary and low, like I was a fragile animal about to spook. It's not about pushing you out. You'll still be here, of course, in the little house by the Westfield. That's where the sun hits best in the mornings. You've always liked that view. Jenna didn't say anything at all. She just sat there, hands folded neatly, watching me like a teacher waiting for a student to obey. I didn't speak either. Instead, I let my eyes move slowly from one face to the next. My children. My blood. The same people I had driven to school in the snow, nursed through broken bones and heartbreaks, fought for when their teachers said they couldn't do better. And now, they were here, dressed like professionals, like strangers. And all they wanted was my signature. The silence stretched until even Belinda's smile began to twitch. Finally, I picked up the pen, not to sign, but to click it, once, twice, 3 times. Then I set it down. I see, I said, my voice even. So this is what it comes to? Travis exhaled through his nose, a sound somewhere between relief and annoyance. No need to drag this out, Mum. It's just business. It's the responsible thing. Business. They had taken my life's work, my marriage, my memories, my sweat, and reduced it to a spreadsheet and a power grab. I looked down at the table, then back at them. I won't sign this, I said. The silence returned, but this time it felt colder. Travis sat back, jaw tightening. You'll lose everything if you don't. Belinda tried again. There's no need for drama, but I had already stood up. You've made your position clear, I said. Now let me make mine. I walked out of the room without looking back. The papers stayed on the table, and so did the 3 of them. I made it to the back porch before the shaking started. Not from fear, not even from anger, but from the weight of it. The shock of realizing that love, real love, might never have been enough. Out there, the land was quiet. Just the soft rustle of cottonwoods and the distant calls of hawks circling the hills. I had spent a lifetime tending that land, planting fences, repairing old posts, burying livestock when winter took too much. In uniform, I used to stand in front of soldiers and issue commands without a quiver in my voice. I managed million-dollar supply chains and evacuated convoys under fire. But nothing in my military life prepared me for the moment your own child looks you in the face and tries to steal what you built while smiling. They thought I would bend. They thought I would be too tired, too lonely, too sentimental. They had no idea what they had just awakened. If you've ever been pushed to the edge by your own blood, then you know. You know the moment where sorrow turns into steel. Let me tell you what happened next. Because I didn't just walk away from that table. I walked into a fight. A quiet one, a smart one. A fight I didn't start, but one I was damn sure going to finish. I stayed out on that porch until the sun dipped behind the far hills. The wind picked up just enough to rattle the tin roof above me. My coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I held on to the mug like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Inside the house, I could still hear muffled voices. They hadn't left yet. Probably still sitting around my kitchen table, strategizing, waiting for me to change my mind, waiting for me to fold. They were wrong. I walked slowly down the porch steps, past the flower beds I had replanted by hand last spring, past the barn I helped rebuild after the storm of '09. I followed the fence line all the way to the gate and leaned against it, looking out over the land. The western pasture had turned gold in the early light. Horses grazed in clusters, heads low, tails flicking gently. The silence was sharp. I had given my life to this land. Not in some metaphorical way. I meant it literally. I had hauled hay bales with a busted back. I had patched roofs in sleet and poured feed in blizzards. This wasn't just a property. This was sweat, muscle, bone. This was home. And now the people I brought into this world wanted me to sign it away like a gym membership. I don't know when it started to happen, the shift. Maybe it was when my husband passed. Or maybe it was long before that. The slow drip of entitlement. The soft erosion of respect. I used to think they were just busy, distracted, stressed. But now I saw it clearly. They had been planning this. Together. That was the part that hurt more than anything. Not just the betrayal, but the unity in it. They had moved as one, like a pack. While I stood alone, I spent most of that night in my study. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just sat there going over every conversation from the past year, every offhand comment, every veiled suggestion. It all made sense now. The strange visits. Jenna asking if I had updated my will. Belinda suddenly offering to manage my mail. Travis pushing to have me sit down and think about the future. It wasn't concern. It was strategy. They thought I wouldn't notice. Or maybe they thought I had started slipping. I was 71, yes, but I still ran this place. I still made every feed order, scheduled every vet visit, tracked every maintenance expense. There wasn't a fence post on this property I didn't know by heart. At 5:17 a.m., I made myself another cup of coffee. Strong, no sugar, same as I drank it in Iraq when we were sleeping out of supply tents in the middle of nowhere. I stood at the window, sipping slow, watching the shadows fade off the field. That was the moment I knew I wasn't going to wait around to be devoured. I pulled out the old metal box from the back of the closet. My service files, land deeds, correspondence from the Department of Defense. Tucked between all that was something I hadn't touched in years, the original land assessment survey. Salt Creek wasn't just any ranch. Parts of it overlapped with military training grounds used during World War II for equine logistics. And I had the documents to prove it. That land wasn't just sentimental. It was historically protected. My late husband never cared much for paperwork. That was always my domain. I kept everything, every receipt, every certificate. Not because I was paranoid, but because I understood systems. That was the army in me. You file, you document, you prepare. Not for now, but for the day someone tries to rewrite your story. By noon, I had filled 2 folders, one with everything tied to the property, the other with personal letters, bank records, and signed authorizations. The third folder, still empty, was for what I was going to do next. I picked up the phone and called Hal Jennings. We hadn't spoken in almost 4 years, but the moment he heard my voice, he answered like no time had passed at all. I said his name. Then I said, "It's time." That was all. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Where do you want to meet?" Hal had been a logistics officer like me. We met during our final deployment. He always said I had the sharpest mind in the unit, and I always said he had the best instincts. He retired 2 years before I did, bought a little house near Laramie, and lived like a man who had already seen too much. Now he was going to help me see this through. Before sunset, I had made my list. A short one. People I could trust. People I couldn't. Actions I would take. I wasn't going to lash out. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't even going to explain myself. Not yet. I had no intention of begging to stay on my own land. They wanted a war built on paperwork. They were about to learn who taught them how to fight. By the time Hal's truck pulled into the gravel drive, I had everything stacked neatly on the kitchen table. It was early afternoon. The air was thick with the kind of heat that made the wood creak and the flies slow. I hadn't opened the front door since the night before. I didn't want to risk seeing any of them. He walked in without knocking. We were both too old for ceremony. Hal was broader now, greyer around the edges, but still had that unshakable steadiness about him. The kind that only came from years in uniform and decades keeping quiet about what you'd seen. He gave me a nod and sat down at the table. No hugs, no small talk, just 2 people who knew what needed to be done. I slid the folder labeled Salt Creek Legal History across to him. He opened it, flipped through slowly, stopping at the old map with the red stamp from the Department of Defense. He whistled low under his breath. Then he looked up and said what I had already known. "This land isn't just yours. Part of it still falls under protected military designation. That's going to matter." "I kept everything," I said. "Every correspondence, every boundary update. And this," I added, handing him the notarized letter from 1984, "confirms it was never fully released to civilian zoning." He took it, read it twice, and nodded again. Smart. That word sat in the air between us for a moment. I hadn't felt smart in a long time, not since the world shifted around me, and I stood still, trying to hold it all together with spit and memory. Hal set the documents down and leaned forward. "They blindsided you, and now they think you're weak." I said nothing. I didn't need to. He understood me better than anyone else alive. We spent the next 2 hours going through every legal angle. Zoning, inheritance, protective status, fiduciary ethics. Hal wasn't a lawyer, but he had spent enough time in contract review to know how things could be challenged. I told him I didn't just want to block the transfer. I wanted to make sure if they ever tried again, they'd be walking into a wall of steel. He leaned back and rubbed his jaw. "Then you'll need someone who's meaner than me." I already called Callahan. That pulled a short laugh out of him. "Of course you did." Retired Judge Robert Callahan lived 45 minutes north, in a cabin with no internet, 2 goats, and a deep distrust of anyone under the age of 60. He was gruff, blunt, and sharp as a whip. He'd once shut down a corporate land grab on behalf of a Vietnam veteran in under a week. I knew he'd be the one. I already had an appointment set with him for the next morning. Hal stood and walked to the window, looking out across the fields. The light had turned amber, slanting through the trees and cutting lines across the barn. "You sure you want to go all the way with this?" he asked, still facing the window. I didn't hesitate. They crossed a line I never thought my children would, and now I have to draw mine. We didn't say much more after that. He left just before dusk, and I watched his taillights disappear down the road. I stood alone on the porch as the sun slipped behind the hills. That night, I didn't sleep much. Instead, I walked the perimeter of the ranch by flashlight, boots crunching over dried grass, the hum of insects thick in the air, every gate latch I checked, every barn door secured. It wasn't about the property. It was about remembering what I had built, what I had protected. This place was mine, not because it was written on paper, but because I had lived every inch of it. I came back inside just after 3 a.m. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list. Not for groceries or errands. A list of boundaries. The things I would no longer tolerate. The version of myself I would no longer suppress. At the top of the list, I wrote, "No more silence," because silence was what had gotten me here. Letting small things slide. Shrugging off dismissive comments. Looking away when they began speaking to me like I was already fading. I had let them think they were stronger, that I was stepping aside. I had handed them my patience like a weapon, and they used it. No more. The next morning I drove to Callahan's cabin. The road twisted through pine and rock, and the heat hadn't broken. When I pulled in, he was already on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He didn't offer a smile, just pointed to the chair beside him. "Hal told me," he said. "Let's see what you've got." We spent 3 hours at his dining table. He read every document, asked precise questions, and took notes on yellow legal pads like it was a military op. When he reached the section about the mental competency clause in the proposed agreement, he stopped and looked at me. "They want to control the narrative, paint you as unstable. That gives them leverage in court. But this," he tapped the service letters and the military commendations I'd included, "this shows a lifetime of leadership and capacity. We can flip that." "I don't want pity," I said. "You won't get it," he replied. "You'll get respect, after we flatten them." By the time I left his cabin, the plan was in place. A formal response, legal counters, public positioning if needed. And most important, a quiet warning sent to the right offices. Nothing flashy, no drama, just force, delivered through channels. They would never see it coming. I drove home with the windows down, the wind in my face, the hum of something old and strong rising again in my chest. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders sat back without effort. I hadn't signed their paper. But I had just started writing something far more dangerous, my own. By the time I pulled into Judge Callahan's driveway the second morning, the plan was no longer a rough idea. It had become an outline with steps, dates, and documentation. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the porch light was on, and the old man was already up, coffee in hand, waiting like he had somewhere better to be. He didn't. He lived for this kind of war. He handed me a legal pad with a list of key statutes already written in his thick, angular script. Military property protections, conditional easement limitations, historical zoning exclusions. I scanned the first few lines and nodded. This wasn't going to be about emotion. This would be about legal force. We didn't speak much over coffee. We didn't need to. He reviewed the second folder I'd brought, the one with scanned copies of the old land plats, a transcript of the zoning board meeting from 1993, and a letter from the Wyoming Veterans Affairs Office confirming the land's previous designation as a low-risk reserve area. It wouldn't win every case, but it would cause just enough confusion to freeze things in their tracks. And that was all I needed right now. Time. Callahan leaned back, his chair creaking under the weight of strategy. He tapped a pen on the table and gave me the next piece. You need pressure. Legal holds them, but pressure moves them. I nodded. I already knew where to apply that pressure. Her name was Martha Green. Martha ran a small-town paper with a modest circulation, but her stories were sharp, factual, and widely shared across the state. She had an entire section and dedicated to elder rights and rural justice. More importantly, she had principles. She and I had gone toe-to-toe years ago about a local infrastructure proposal, and though we disagreed, she never misquoted me. She'd built a reputation for truth-telling. Now, I needed that truth on my side. That afternoon, I called her direct. No assistance, no email, just voice to voice. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what happened. No tears, no pleading, just the facts. My children had gathered at the house. They presented me with a legal document. They asked me to hand over the land. They added a clause implying mental incompetence. They told me it was time to step aside. I told her about the land's military history, the old maps, the zoning holdovers. I gave her names, dates, and the letter from Veterans Affairs. Then I told her about the silence in that room, the way none of them blinked when I read that clause out loud. Martha didn't interrupt. She never did. When I finished, she only said, "I'm coming by in the morning." True to her word, she showed up at 9 a.m. with a notebook, a recorder, and 2 black coffees. She didn't ask to be let in. I opened the door, and she walked straight to the kitchen table like it belonged to her. The interview took 2 hours. She was thorough. She asked about my military background, my late husband, the history of Salt Creek, and the relationship with my children. I gave her everything but the tears. Those stayed locked up where they belonged. She left with a copy of the map and a folder of supporting documents. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. I spent that time preparing the rest. I called my accountant. I met with the bank to freeze any co-signed permissions still attached to my name. I pulled old emails from Travis where he had suggested streamlining the deed process. I flagged them and saved backups. The more I moved, the calmer I became. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even anger. It was discipline. It was control, something I had trained for most of my life. In logistics, you anticipate failure and build systems that survive it. That was what I was doing now. On the morning of the 3rd day, Martha's article dropped online first. The title was short, direct, and cut like a blade. Veteran and ranch owner. Pressured by her children to sign away historic land. The subheading read, "Clauses citing mental clarity raise red flags about elder coercion." The story spread, not like wildfire, but like something slower and more dangerous. Local outlets picked it up. One state paper ran a segment in their Sunday edition. The comments started rolling in. People remembered me from the VFW chapter, from the feed store, from church. My name meant something in that town. It meant work. It meant history. It meant resilience. I didn't speak publicly. I didn't need to. The story spoke for me. I spent that Sunday in the back garden, clipping dead rose heads and sweeping the porch. I saw Belinda's car drive by twice. She didn't stop. Good. The next day, Travis called. I didn't answer. By evening, Jenna sent a text asking if we could talk without the drama. I turned off the phone. I had no interest in soft apologies. They had made their intentions clear. My only job now was to make sure they didn't get a second chance. That evening, I met Hal at the diner off Route 14. He had already read the article. So had everyone else. The waitress gave me free pie, and the owner stopped by to say, "Good for you, Lorraine." Hal sipped his coffee and smiled at me across the booth. "Well," he said, "looks like the quiet strike landed." I nodded. This is just the beginning. And it was. I had drawn the line, and now they were going to learn what it meant to cross it. The silence from my children didn't last long. On Monday afternoon, Belinda showed up at my gate in her tan SUV, the same one she'd bought 2 years ago with a down payment I had quietly wired from my savings. She sat in the car for a while before finally stepping out and walking slowly toward the porch. She didn't knock. She stood there, as if waiting for the door to open on its own. I didn't move. I watched her from the kitchen window, arms crossed, a dish towel in one hand. I could see the way her mouth twitched with restrained urgency, the way her posture leaned forward just slightly. She wasn't there for reconciliation. She was there to negotiate. Eventually, she called my name, not loudly, but with the same commanding tone she'd once used on her own children when they misbehaved at Sunday dinners. I opened the door slowly and leaned on the frame. Her first words were not hello. "I think we both know this has gotten out of hand." I said nothing, just looked at her. She continued, her voice straining for control. "We need to talk about the article, about what you said. The family is upset. Travis has had calls from the office. Jenna's clients are asking questions." I waited. She finally added, "We're willing to revise the document." That made me laugh, out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. A few cracks in their plan, and suddenly they remembered how to offer olive branches. But there was no branch, only another trick wrapped in polite language. "Belinda," I said, my voice quiet, steady, "you were all willing to have me sign away everything I built, and now you're concerned about reputation." She didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "You made it public. You made it necessary." She looked down for the first time, her thumb twisting the ring on her finger. Then came the real reason for her visit. "If this continues, there will be damage, not just to the family name, to assets, to relationships. You could lose sympathy if people start looking into some of your past decisions. The land, the tax filings, that inheritance you never reported in 2002. That was when the last thread snapped. So they had gone digging. So they had prepared their own counteroffensive. I expected it. In fact, I counted on it. And unlike them, I had nothing to hide. Everything they would find, I had already disclosed to Callahan. Every dollar, every clause, every mistake. I had cleaned house before they even thought to look. So I stepped forward, calm, eyes locked on hers. "Do what you need to do," I said, "but do it quickly." And I shut the door. That evening, the legal package arrived by courier. 42 pages, a reworded proposal, less obvious manipulation, more veiled pressure. There were terms like custodial flexibility and legacy restructuring. All of it dressed up in corporate language. But the meaning was still clear. They still wanted control. Control of the land, control of the story, control of me. I didn't sign. Instead, I sent a certified letter through Callahan's office, notifying them that any further attempt to coerce, defame, or manipulate legal holdings tied to my name would be met with a formal civil complaint and a request for a public injunction. 3 days later, the retaliation began. The first was small. A zoning request filed anonymously, flagging my southern fence line as a potential environmental hazard. The next was larger. A complaint filed with the county office regarding a supposed misuse of veteran tax exemptions. Then, the whisper campaign. Subtle mentions at church, cold shoulders at the feed store, a few acquaintances who suddenly stopped calling. It didn't hurt. Not in the way they intended. It made me sharper. I met with Martha again, this time off the record. She'd gotten wind of the counters. She asked if I wanted to go public with the retaliation. No, I told her. Not yet. Let them overplay their hand. And they did. Travis went too far. He tried to access one of my inactive bank accounts tied to the ranch's agricultural subsidies. He used a login from years ago, probably thinking I hadn't changed the credentials. But the system flagged it, and within an hour, the bank called me directly. I reported it. Not just to the bank, but to a friend at the sheriff's department. No formal charges. Not yet. But enough to plant a warning. Enough to document the attempt. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept with the windows open. The Wyoming air rolled in cool and dry, and the creak of the windmill outside reminded me that some things still turned without permission. I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting to remain, to hold the line between memory and erasure, to prove that a woman who wore a uniform for 3 decades, who buried a husband under a cedar tree behind the chapel, who raised 3 children under one roof with discipline and love, did not exist to be overwritten when it no longer suited their ambitions. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering. 2 days after the bank incident, I found an envelope in my mailbox without a stamp or return address. Tucked behind the usual stack of bills and circulars, it was plain, cream-coloured, folded neatly. Inside was a single typed line on textured paper. They're planning to sell the ranch behind your back. There's a buyer already lined up. No signature, no clue who sent it. But I didn't need much to believe it. My children had already made it clear that they saw my home, my land, my life as a transaction. One that could be finished with a signature, or, failing that, a quiet legal maneuver. I set the note on the table and sat down, letting the words settle. For a while, I just listened. The low hum of the refrigerator, the click of the ceiling fan, the wind brushing the side of the house like an old friend reminding me I was still here. Then I picked up the phone and called McKenna. She was one of the few who still checked in since everything began unraveling. A retired Air Force officer turned estate consultant, McKenna wasn't one to dance around subjects. She had been stationed with me once, back in Nevada, and had that same no-nonsense backbone I respected. When I told her about the letter, there was no gasp, no dramatic pause, just a sharp breath and a calm reply. I believe it. You'd better come by. Her office was 2 towns over, a narrow building wedged between a tractor dealership and a tax service. Inside, it smelled like cinnamon and copy paper. We sat across from each other, and she pulled up the property database before I even finished explaining. There, she pointed. Filed 3 weeks ago. An exploratory inquiry from a private equity group in Denver. No formal listing yet, but they've flagged your ranch on an internal report. I leaned in. But the land isn't for sale. She looked at me the way soldiers look at maps before a battle. Not publicly, but if your name isn't cleanly on every holding, if any of those kids moved partial ownership around while acting as trustees or attempted to access financial structures under your name, they could be setting up a transfer agreement. All they need is one signature forged well enough to confuse a distracted clerk. I exhaled slowly. How do we stop it? McKenna's fingers tapped lightly on the desk. We don't stop it. We expose it. She explained what needed to be done. First, a forensic review of every landholding and title transfer filed in the past 6 years. Then, a legal freeze on any potential sales involving my ranch without personal, notarized consent. She had the right contacts, not in big city firms, but in quiet legal offices in counties that still believed in handshakes and paper trails. By the end of the afternoon, she'd initiated a flag request on the parcel numbers tied to the ranch and set up a preliminary review with a regional title office. And I remembered again why women like McKenna lasted so long in the service. They didn't just fight. They watched. They planned. They dismantled problems without making noise. Driving home that evening, the clouds gathered above the foothills in long grey streaks. The land looked different now. Not weaker, not threatened, but awake. I spent that night walking the boundary fence. I hadn't done that in years. The wood slats were rough beneath my palm. The barbed wire caught the dusk light like threads of warning. And all the while, I remembered the early days after James died. How I thought I wouldn't survive the silence of an empty bed, the hum of the house with no one answering my questions. But I did. And now, once again, I was standing in the silence, but not empty, prepared. 2 mornings later, I received another surprise. It was Grace, not Belinda, not Travis, not Jenna, Grace Weston, my late husband's old friend. She had worked with him on several land use projects in the late 90s. I hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. She pulled up in a cherry-red truck, got out with the same brisk energy she always carried. Her hair was white now, cut short. Her jacket bore the insignia of a conservation trust I hadn't heard of before. "I saw something that made me think of you," she said, holding out a manila folder. "James once talked about preserving this land, in case the family ever tried to split it." I took the folder. Inside were handwritten notes, James' sketches of zoning overlays, and a draft letter to the Department of Agriculture, proposing a long-term conservation easement. It had never been filed. "He said he never pushed you about it because you were still grieving," Grace added gently. "But I think he knew. One day this land might need to be protected from your own." My throat tightened. I hadn't seen this coming. Not this document, not this ally. Grace sat with me at the kitchen table as I read every page. She explained that the easement could still be activated, with my consent. It would permanently restrict the land from being commercially developed or sold for private equity exploitation. And it would ensure that whoever tried to take it would be tied up in federal oversight for years, if not decades. "You wouldn't lose the ranch," she said, "but you'd put a wall around it, one they can't breach." That night, I stayed up late, reading James's handwriting by lamplight. His cursive was still strong, steady, and in those pages, I didn't just see legal protection. I saw love, a silent plan he'd made without telling me, as if to say, "If they ever come for you, I'll still be here." It was time to act. The land would not be sold. The mother would not be erased. And the next move would not be defense. It would be the beginning of a public reckoning. The night I invited them all over was cold and unusually silent. Early November in Wyoming had a way of scraping the warmth off the bones of the land. I lit the fireplace not for comfort, but for memory, for the smell of burning pine that once meant family and laughter, and long evening filled with the sound of boots by the door, and James whistling while he stirred chili. I set the table the way I used to when the kids were young. No paper plates, no plastic cups. Bone-white porcelain, the same ones my mother had used when guests came over. Silver polished by hand. Even the linen napkins, folded in the shape of cranes. The dining room glowed soft and golden, with low lamps and candles flickering in silence. They all came. Jenna arrived first, punctual as always, her scarf wrapped too tightly, and her mouth set in that familiar line between polite contempt and annoyance. Travis showed up with Belinda close behind, both of them wrapped in coats too expensive for our town, arms crossed as if this gathering was beneath them. McKenna was already upstairs in my office, waiting. She wasn't going to be part of dinner. Her work would come later. We sat. No one asked why I invited them. No one needed to. I could feel the tension rolling off them, the eyes glancing at each other, measuring the temperature, wondering whether they needed to stay sweet or shift into aggression. I passed the cornbread. They passed it along like a baton, not meeting my eyes. Dinner moved slowly. I spoke little. I served stew, I refilled water, I watched them shift in their seats. And then I stood. The silence that followed was thick. I let it stretch, standing at the head of the table the way James used to. "I found the draft," I said. "The conservation easement James planned years ago." No one said a word. Travis cleared his throat. Jenna looked at her nails. "I know about the buyer in Denver," I continued. "I know about the exploratory filing. And I know you've been moving assets behind my back." Still, silence. Then Jenna scoffed. "Mum, we were protecting you. You're not getting any younger. This place is a burden." "A burden?" I repeated, nodding. "That's what you think this is." I walked over to the fireplace and pulled out a folder I'd left tucked behind the mantel. I set it down on the table and opened it to the first page. "That's the signed agreement," I said. "Filed this morning. The land is now protected by a federal conservation easement. It cannot be developed, sold, or partitioned. Not by you. Not by anyone." Jenna paled. Belinda leaned forward. "You had no right." "I had every right," I said, sharper now. "I've kept quiet. I've tried to believe the best in you. But that ended when you handed me a fake inheritance contract and asked me to sign away my home in exchange for living in a room like a guest in my own house." Travis muttered something under his breath. I stepped closer. "I know about the power of attorney attempt, the forged financial statements, the quiet loan request using the ranch as collateral. And I know about the false signatures." For the first time, their masks cracked. "You think you've outsmarted an old woman," I said quietly. "But I spent 29 years in the military. I've read classified documents in the dead of night with enemy drones overhead. I know how to read silence. I know how to see betrayal. And I've seen everything I needed in your eyes." I turned and pointed toward the hallway. "You need to leave." Jenna stood abruptly. "You can't throw us out. We're your children." "You stopped acting like my children the moment you treated me like a legal problem to solve." They all stood now, voices rising, words turning sharp. But I stayed rooted. My voice stayed calm. "This dinner was your chance to come clean. You didn't. So now I will pursue every legal measure available. And I'll make sure your names are removed from every structure that once included you out of love, not obligation." Jenna laughed bitterly. "You think anyone cares about a bitter old woman making threats in a ranch house?" I smiled. "McKenna's been upstairs this whole time. She's recording this for the legal deposition, and the sheriff's deputy will be here shortly to deliver the paperwork." Travis swore. Belinda looked like she'd been slapped. Jenna backed up toward the door. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice shook. Moments later, the front door knocked once, firm and official. I walked over and opened it. Deputy Harris, steady and quiet, stepped in. He nodded at me, then at the three stunned adults still frozen around the dining room table. "I've got the delivery right here," he said calmly. They left in silence. No hugs, no goodbyes, no final words. After the door shut, I leaned against the wood, my legs trembling slightly, not from fear, from release. The table still held the uneaten food, the glasses half filled, the fire burning low behind me. But something had changed. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was in control. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat at the head of the table. There was no need to clean up yet. This was the night the tide turned, and it deserved to sit in silence for a little longer. By morning, the frost had laid its silver film across the porch railings, and the coffee I brewed felt like armor more than comfort. My bones were tired, not from age, but from holding the weight of disappointment for too long. The echo of last night's confrontation still rang in the air, though the house itself had never felt quieter. The sheriff's deputy had barely closed the door before I called McKenna downstairs. She didn't say a word, just walked over to the laptop where the recording was saved. Her eyes told me she knew exactly what I needed next. "Upload it," I said. "Then forward it to the estate attorney, the trust litigation team, and the private investigator in Billings." She nodded. Quiet. Efficient. Trusted. McKenna had been with me for 7 years, first as a ranch hand, then as a personal assistant, and eventually something like a daughter. She never asked for more than her fair wage, never asked why I kept documents locked in my old gun safe, or why I recorded calls when certain people phoned. She had military parents too. She understood protocols. More importantly, she understood betrayal. By noon, 3 law firms had responded. My attorney, Joseph Maddox, had already drafted emergency filings. By end of day, we'd frozen all major assets tied to the ranch and to the family trust. That included several accounts that Jenna had quietly funneled money into under the guise of maintenance reserves. Travis and Belinda's name had appeared on a joint development proposal for a luxury eco-housing initiative backed by speculative investors. It was now dead in the water. The surprise wasn't that they had tried to sell pieces of the land. The surprise was how long they had planned it. Decades, maybe. Tiny nudges, passive comments, the way they subtly kept me out of meetings about taxes, about upkeep, about grant options. And now, every stone they'd turned trying to bury me was being turned back over in court. Joseph had a tone I hadn't heard in years. Focused, methodical, slightly dangerous. He knew the judge who'd be reviewing the motions. He had represented 3 cases just like this in the past decade. Children attempting to strip elderly parents of control, using soft power, social manipulation, legal ambiguity. This was bigger than just betrayal. This was war on my autonomy. We filed for a temporary restraining order against Travis and Jenna from setting foot on the property. We also froze the limited liability company they had set up behind my back. All checks and payments required dual authorization now, mine and McKenna's. It would take weeks to unwind it fully, but the bleeding had stopped. By the end of the second day, I had gone through every folder in the gun safe. Not out of fear, but out of ritual. I checked James's will again, though I knew every word. I double-checked the clause about full property rights, passing solely to me, no conditions. I found the handwritten letter he had tucked behind the final page. "I trust you'll know when to use what we built." That sentence sat with me longer than I expected. Out back, the old barn stood empty but strong. The horses were long gone, but I could still smell the leather of James's saddle. I walked through it slowly, one hand brushing the rails, the same ones I once leaned against when Jenna brought her first boyfriend over, and James stared the poor kid into stammering silence. I stopped in the corner bay, the one Travis had tried to convert into an office when he temporarily moved home after his second failed startup. I could still see the outlines of the plans he had drawn in chalk: partition walls, a skylight, a separate entrance. as if this place was ever going to be his. The past 3 days moved fast. Court dates were set. McKenna handled the paperwork like she'd trained for this her whole life. I gave her power of attorney, limited but effective, just in case they tried anything with me directly again. I started carrying a small recorder again too. Old habits. That evening, I got a letter from Jenna's attorney. Thinly veiled threats masked as pleas. Something about restorative mediation, about preserving the family's unity before this escalated. I didn't respond. Instead, I wrote a letter of my own. It wasn't addressed to Jenna, or to Travis, or even to Belinda. It was for the State Bar Association. A formal ethics complaint regarding the legal manipulation of a vulnerable senior, backed by recordings, emails, and testimony from McKenna and Deputy Harris. Let the law decide what lines they crossed. The house was still quiet. But now the silence felt earned. Every document had been filed, every protection put in place. Every bond that could rot had been cut. And for the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up to check the locks. Not because I felt safe, but because I had finally stopped pretending the danger was just in my head. It wasn't. It had lived under my roof, and now it was out in the open, where it belonged. The invitation came in a pale cream envelope, with my name written in Jenna's precise handwriting. Inside was a folded card, elegant and professional. It read, "Dinner at the Prescott House, 6:30 p.m. Friday, a fresh start." I stared at the card for a while, not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I understood it all too well. Jenna had always used softness as a weapon, polite tones, perfect grammar, graceful wording designed to deflect the truth. Her version of fresh start usually meant I needed to forget what happened and accept the new rules written by her. But I accepted the invitation, not out of hope, out of strategy. I had already begun to draft my new will. Joseph Maddox had it in final review. The trust restructure was days from completion. I needed this dinner to happen. I needed them to believe the storm had passed, that I was weakened, that I was going to give in. McKenna drove me to the edge of the driveway and waited there. She understood without needing instruction. If I didn't call or come back within 3 hours, she would activate a contingency email to both Joseph and the local sheriff. She had copies of everything. I walked the rest of the way up the gravel path alone. Inside the house, everything looked staged. Jenna had lit every candle, set the table in full holiday fashion, even arranged place cards. My name was spelled correctly. That told me it wasn't a rushed plan. They had rehearsed this. Jenna greeted me at the door, lips stiff, eyes alert. Travis poured wine without being asked, and Belinda gave me a hug that didn't touch her shoulders. We made small talk over salad, canned laughter, commenting on the weather, a few memories about James, tossed in like seasoning. But it was all noise. They were waiting. So was I. It came right before dessert. Jenna cleared her throat and looked across the table. "We've been thinking," she said, voice sugar-coated, "about how to move forward as a family." Travis nodded. "We talked to a mediator, someone who understands these generational disputes." Belinda leaned in. "It doesn't have to be like this. There's still time for healing." Then Jenna slid the folder across the table. There it was. Again. The same inheritance document, reworded slightly, softer terms. But the core was unchanged. The ranch goes to them. I would retain occupancy rights in the house. Any significant sales or transactions would require unanimous sibling approval, and they would handle ongoing management of the land. "Sign it," Jenna said. "Tonight. Let's make this right." I took a long sip of water and set the glass down slowly. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded envelope of my own. "This is my final estate arrangement," I said. Jenna flinched first. Travis went pale. Belinda stared at the envelope like it was a bomb. "I've converted the ranch into a private land trust," I said, calm and even. "It will remain undeveloped, protected. The house will be maintained by a foundation in my name. When I pass, a scholarship will be granted every year to a woman veteran over 60 who wants to pursue land management or environmental science." Belinda's mouth opened, then shut again. Jenna blinked, but said nothing. Travis stood up abruptly. "That's theft. That's fraud. This land is ours." I didn't flinch. I didn't shout. I stood too. This land was never yours. Not by law, not by effort, not by heart. Silence filled the room. I continued. "The names on the paperwork won't be yours. The rights have been reassigned, the assets frozen. The developers you were secretly working with have pulled out. They know now you forged authorizations. The court does too." Travis took a step toward me, fists clenched. Jenna moved to hold him back. And then Belinda snapped. "We should have pushed her sooner," she hissed. "She was always going to pull this, playing the victim. Always the war hero, never the mother." I turned slowly to her. "You're right. I was never the kind of mother who gave her children free rein to destroy what their father built. And I am no one's victim." McKenna's voice crackled softly in my earpiece. A small Bluetooth hidden under my scarf. "Audio recorded. Video feed stable. I've got everything." I turned and walked out. My hands didn't shake. They didn't follow. Back at the ranch, McKenna had already begun backing up the footage. Joseph would submit it to the ethics board by morning. The estate judge had scheduled a hearing, and 3 donors had already pledged support for the new trust foundation. Everything that mattered was no longer in their hands. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace not as a feeling, but as a boundary. And that boundary had finally been drawn. By the time the hearing date was confirmed, the damage had already begun to unravel on their end. What I had put in motion at the dinner table was just the start. What followed was the collapse. 3 days after I walked out of their so-called peace offering, Travis's bank accounts were frozen due to suspicious wire transfers connected to a dormant LLC registered in Nevada. Joseph had uncovered it weeks earlier while preparing the trust documentation. It was supposed to be used as a holding vehicle for a silent buyout offer on my land. Travis had used forged power of attorney documents to initiate the process. He was caught, not just morally, but legally. Belinda, meanwhile, found herself at the center of an internal audit at the hospital where she worked in administration. A whistleblower complaint had flagged conflict of interest. She had attempted to redirect a donor grant to a private foundation that, on paper, had no ties to her. In reality, that foundation was run by a close friend of Jenna. And the donor behind the grant? The same woman veteran who had signed up early for our land trust program. McKenna's contact. Jenna herself wasn't spared either. A quiet letter arrived from the family court, notifying her that a formal inquiry was being opened regarding guardianship fraud. During the months after James passed, Jenna had submitted documents declaring I was mentally compromised and unable to manage the estate. She had done this without my knowledge, as a preemptive move to position herself and Travis as financial proxies. The court had those documents now, and they had my medical evaluations to prove otherwise. It felt surreal to see them spin in circles, no longer the architects of manipulation, but the ones being audited, investigated, and questioned. Their pressurized control, once so tightly wound around me, began to snap, strand by strand. The trust foundation I established gained media attention after a local news outlet, ran a segment on veterans and late-life reinvention. My story, while anonymized, was referenced in the piece. Viewership climbed. Donations poured in. Joseph and I sat in his office the following Monday, sipping coffee as the headlines rolled across his second monitor. "They never expected resistance," he said. "No," I replied. "They expected silence." That evening, I walked the property alone. The air smelled of dust and pine, with early fall creeping into the corners of the land. A quiet settled over me that I hadn't felt in years, not the hush of waiting, but the stillness of something finished. But of course, nothing truly ends without confrontation. The knock came late. McKenna opened the door first, but I stepped past her. I knew who it would be, and I was ready. Jenna stood outside, no makeup, wind-blown hair, holding a folder in one hand. She looked worn, not pitiful, but like someone who had finally run out of leverage. "I need to talk to you," she said. No pretense. I nodded and stepped aside. We sat in the front room, lights low, quiet enough to hear the clock ticking. She placed the folder on the coffee table, but didn't slide it toward me. That was new. "I spoke to our attorney," she began, "and we understand that contesting your new estate plan is not viable. Everything is protected. Everything has been legally vetted. The developers dropped out. Travis is facing formal charges, and Belinda may lose her license." I said nothing. She went on. "I wanted you to know that I never hated you. I just thought you didn't see me." I raised my eyes. "You spent years making sure I didn't see myself." She looked down. "I understand if you never want to speak again," she said. "But I needed to tell you. I was wrong. About everything." Silence sat between us for several breaths. "I loved James," she added, voice cracking. "But I was always jealous of how much he trusted you. I tried to take what you had because I thought I deserved it. But now, I see the difference. You earned it. I demanded it." I let the words hang there. Then I said, "Do you remember the day I returned from Kuwait? The medals? The ceremony?" She nodded slowly. "You were the only one who didn't show up." "I thought I wasn't needed," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, you just didn't want to sit in a crowd that cheered for me. You only knew how to love people when they were beneath you." Jenna's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to protest, but no words came. I stood. "I forgive you, Jenna, but I no longer include you." Her breath caught. "You may rebuild your life," I said, "but not inside mine." She nodded, barely, then stood. She left the folder behind, unopened. After she walked out, I sat back down and finally opened it. Inside were the original photos from the day James proposed to me. I hadn't seen them in years. They had been missing from the albums for decades. And a handwritten note in Jenna's careful script. "For what it's worth," it read, "he was right to trust you." That night, I slept without dreams. No shadows of old wars. No courtroom anxiety. No bitterness. Just breath. And a house that no longer echoed with ghosts of permission. The day after Jenna's visit, the air around the house felt different. Not just lighter, but clearer. I moved through the rooms without feeling the pull of old accusations or resentments. The weight that had once settled behind my ribs each time I passed the front window or opened the kitchen drawer was gone. But I knew there was still one conversation waiting, one confrontation I hadn't yet faced. Travis. The news from Joseph had come in that morning. Travis had accepted a plea deal, 2 years of probation and restitution payments were part of the agreement, no prison time. It wasn't justice in the way some might define it, but it was a record, a public record that followed him. His name would no longer come up in real estate circles without a sideways glance. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt done, and yet there was still a part of me that needed to say something, not out of rage, not to hurt him, just to close it, truly and finally. Joseph made the call on my behalf. Travis agreed to meet at his attorney's office. Neutral ground, no drama. I drove myself there. Didn't ask McKenna or anyone else to come. Some battles are personal, even when the war is over. When I entered the conference room, Travis was already seated. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. His suit hung a little looser than usual. No smug grin, no mask. Just my son, quiet and fraying at the edges. I sat down across from him. The room was silent, except for the distant hum of a copier in the hallway. "You wanted this meeting," I said, calm but steady. He nodded slowly. "I did." "I don't need an apology," I added. "So if that's why we're here, you can save your breath." Travis exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on the table. "I don't have one," he said. "Not one that would matter." I appreciated the honesty, even if it came too late. He went on. "You built something, not just the land or the house. You built a name, a purpose. I thought I could shape it into something bigger, something more mine." "It was never yours," I said. "Not the land, not the story, and certainly not my trust." His eyes flicked up to meet mine. For a moment, I saw something familiar. The boy who once ran across this ranch barefoot, chasing fireflies. The boy who cried when the dog died. The boy who hugged me too tight when his dad didn't come home for Christmas. He was still in there, just buried under decades of calculation. "I lost more than a case," he said quietly. "I lost you." I tilted my head slightly. "You lost me the day you decided I was expendable." A long silence followed. He tapped his fingers against the folder in front of him. "I've accepted the terms. I'm moving to Albuquerque, starting over. No business, no leverage, just work. Paperwork, finance, something boring." I nodded. "Then make it honest, and make it count." He didn't reply. He only nodded again. I stood. The conversation had gone as far as it would go. "Don't contact me," I said. "Not until you've lived one full year without lying, manipulating, or taking from another person. If you can do that, we'll see." His face didn't change. No protests, no outburst. As I reached the door, he spoke one last time. "I kept the photo," he said, "of you and Dad, at your commissioning." That one stopped me. I didn't turn, but my voice softened. "Then remember who raised you, and why I walked away." I left the building without looking back. The sky outside was a dull overcast, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, I felt nothing tethering me to the past. No invisible lines pulling me into obligation. No invisible contracts keeping me bound. I went home. McKenna was tending to the herb garden out front. She didn't ask how the meeting went. She just smiled and handed me a pair of gloves. "We've got lavender to replant," she said. And that was all I needed. That evening, after washing up, I sat alone in my study. I looked through the letters James had written during deployment. There were only a few left. Most had faded or been lost. But the ones that remained, I read over and over, memorizing the curves of his handwriting, the cadence of his voice. One letter stood out, dated the week after I received my promotion. He had written, "You've always led with dignity, not the loudest voice, but the one that echoes longest." I traced the sentence with my fingertip. That was all I ever wanted, to lead with dignity, even in silence. That night, I slept with the window open. The wind moved through the curtains, soft and steady. No ghosts, no noise, just peace. The lavender bloomed earlier that year. McKenna said it was because the soil had finally settled after the heavy rains. I thought it was something else. Maybe the land, like me, had finally unclenched. Life didn't rush after everything unraveled. It moved slowly, respectfully, like it understood the weight of all that had happened. Every morning, I walked the path around the edge of the ranch with my coffee, same boots, same hat I wore during inspections years ago. No clipboard this time, just habit, just presence. Sometimes McKenna joined me, sometimes Jenna. Sometimes it was just the wind and the quiet sounds of horses stirring in the distance. I had donated part of the property to a local women's veterans shelter, and they were in the process of building cabins near the south pasture. The place would house women with nowhere else to go, those caught between military service and the civilian world, between usefulness and invisibility. I knew that place well. It felt right, not as a legacy, but as something I could witness in real time. Lives shifting, women standing taller, daughters of strangers finding safety among lavender fields. As for Travis, I hadn't heard from him, and I didn't expect to. McKenna told me once, over iced tea on the porch, that she saw his name pop up in a trade journal. Small job, low profile, out of state. That was enough. I didn't need redemption, just distance. I kept a few things from that chapter of my life. My old army commendations, a photo of James smiling on the back of our first tractor, and a worn manila folder labeled Estate Final Version. That folder now held the new documents, drawn and notarized, that detailed what would become of the land after I passed. None of the children's names were on it. Instead, the beneficiaries were clear and clean: the shelter, the Veterans Fund, and one trust for Jenna's daughter, to be unlocked only if she turned 25 and graduated from a public college. I didn't believe in revenge, but I believed in boundaries and clarity. The neighbors stopped by more frequently after all the noise died down. They brought pie. They stayed longer. I guess it's easier to visit a house that no longer feels like a battlefield. One afternoon, I stood on the back porch, watching two girls from the shelter learning how to groom a horse. McKenna supervised nearby, arms crossed like an old drill sergeant, barking corrections that somehow still felt gentle. The scene reminded me of my first command, of standing in front of strangers and trying to become something they could trust. I failed often, but I kept showing up. And maybe that's what this ranch had become. Not a monument to survival, but a place to start again. Later that evening, Jenna came by with her daughter. They brought dinner, homemade lasagna, store-bought salad. I didn't ask which one was which. I just pulled out the plates. At the table, Jenna looked around and smiled. "The place feels different." "It is," I said, "because I am." Her daughter, just 9, leaned into me and whispered that she wanted to live here someday. I smiled and kissed the top of her head. Maybe she would, or maybe she'd go build something entirely her own. Either way, she'd know where she came from. That night, before bed, I stood alone in the hallway. My hand brushed the frame of the photo Travis had mentioned, the one of James and me on the day of my promotion. I had taken it down a while ago, but tonight I put it back up. Not out of nostalgia, but because the woman in that photo still lived here. I turned off the lights and walked to my room. Outside, The wind pressed gently against the window panes, and somewhere beyond the trees, the lavender carried its scent like a quiet anthem. I was no longer waiting for peace. I had made it. If you've ever felt discarded by those you loved most, or had to rebuild your life from the ashes of betrayal, you are not alone. What boundaries have you set that changed everything? I'd love to hear your journey. And if this story stirred something in you, let it remind you, it's never too late to choose yourself again.